There are names history chooses to remember, and names it chooses to bury beneath dust and silence. Some are preserved in marble and ink. Others survive only as whispers, distorted by rumor, softened by myth, or erased entirely because the truth they carried was too dangerous to keep intact. The name Marie Laveau exists in both worlds at once, celebrated in folklore, reduced to superstition, transformed into spectacle. But the woman whose story you are about to hear was not a legend meant for tourists or a ghost wrapped in ceremony. She was something far more unsettling. A woman whose power did not come from magic, but from understanding, and that understanding threatened the very structure of the world she lived in. What follows is not the version taught in classrooms or summarized in textbooks. It is not a story of chains and whips alone, nor of passive suffering waiting for rescue. It is the story America refused to teach because it exposes a truth too uncomfortable to confront. That within the machinery of slavery existed minds that studied it, mapped it, and learned how to quietly dismantle it from the inside. And at the center of this story is a Mississippi slave whose real legacy was deliberately obscured because knowledge, when wielded with precision, is more dangerous than rebellion. In 1839, Adams County, Mississippi was a landscape shaped by cotton and control. The Mississippi River cut through the land like a living artery, carrying wealth southward to New Orleans and ambition northward to men who measured success in acreage and human lives. Plantations stretched for miles, their boundaries defined not just by fences and fields, but by rigid hierarchies enforced through violence, fear, and law. Among them stood the Caldwell Plantation, nearly 3,000 acres of fertile bottomland, its white columned house rising above the fields like a symbol of refinement built on suffering. The plantation functioned as a self-contained kingdom. At its peak lived nearly 250 enslaved men, women, and children, each assigned a role within a system designed for maximum extraction and minimal resistance. At the top was Jonathan Caldwell, a man in his early 50s who inherited both land and people from his father. His wife, Margaret Caldwell, ran the household with meticulous order, believing discipline was a form of morality. Their eldest son, William, studied law in Natchez, his ambitions aimed toward politics and social prestige. Below them stood the overseers, men like Elijah Crow, tasked with maintaining productivity while ensuring fear never gave way to unity. Crow was lean, methodical, and deliberate. He understood that broken bodies reduced profit, so his cruelty was calculated rather than impulsive. Punishments were measured, just enough pain to remind, never enough to destroy. He kept detailed ledgers, tracking output, discipline, and losses, believing order was preserved through numbers as much as force. Beneath him were assistant overseers, foremen, and drivers, each enforcing authority downward until it reached the quarters where survival depended on obedience and silence. Into this world came Marie Laveau on a gray Tuesday in March. She arrived not as a spectacle, but as inventory. Purchased at auction in Natchez for $850, she had stood on the wooden platform with her eyes lowered and her posture composed. Buyers examined her hands, her teeth, the set of her shoulders. The bill of sale described her as healthy, skilled in household labor, knowledgeable in herbs, approximately 23 years of age. It noted, almost casually, that she could read. That single word should have raised alarms. Mississippi law forbade teaching enslaved people to read, punishable by whipping or worse. But to the Caldwell agent handling the purchase, literacy meant efficiency. A slave who could read invoices, track supplies, and follow written instructions was an asset. He did not ask where Marie had learned. He did not question why her previous owner in Louisiana had sold her despite her value. He accepted the vague explanation of downsizing and moved on. The truth was simpler and more troubling. Her former owner had grown afraid of her. Not because she disobeyed, not because she resisted, but because events around her had begun to shift in ways he could not explain. Accusations collapsed, punishments were avoided, information traveled where it should not have. He could never prove her involvement, but superstition filled the gaps where evidence failed, and superstition, in the South, was often enough. Marie arrived at Caldwell Plantation in the back of a wagon, her possessions wrapped in a cloth bundle. She was assigned to the domestic quarters behind the main house, cabins marginally better than those in the fields, though still stripped of privacy and comfort. She shared her space with 3 women who had learned power through habit rather than books. Sarah, who managed laundry and knew every schedule in the household, Eliza, who worked in the kitchen and spoke little, and Ruth, a young seamstress whose hands were always moving, even in sleep. That first night, Marie said very little. She unpacked carefully. A small wooden box of needles and thread, bundles of dried plants with faint medicinal scents, and a leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with use. She kept it hidden, wrapped in oilcloth, buried beneath her things. "You can read," Sarah said quietly, watching her. Marie met her gaze without hesitation. "I remember things," she replied. "Marks help me remember." It was not a lie. It was not the whole truth either. And Sarah understood the intelligence in the answer. On a plantation like Caldwell's, knowing how much to reveal could mean the difference between safety and ruin. That next morning, Marie was taken to meet the head cook, an older woman named Hester, whose authority within the domestic hierarchy was unquestioned. Hester had worked the Caldwell kitchen for decades and trusted no one easily. She examined Marie with a practiced eye and asked one question. "You know herbs?" Marie nodded. She spoke of fever bark, poultices, teas for pain and sleep. She spoke calmly, without exaggeration. Hester listened, then led her to the neglected herb garden behind the kitchen. Weeds choked the beds, plants struggled for light, but Marie saw structure beneath the decay. "You'll tend this," Hester said. "People get sick, you'll tend them too. Keep track of what you use." The assignment mattered. It gave Marie movement, access, a reason to travel between quarters, kitchen, and house, a reason to listen. And listen she did. In the weeks that followed, Marie worked quietly, efficiently. She restored the garden, planted carefully, cataloged growth. But while her hands tended the soil, her mind studied something far more complex. She watched how information moved, who spoke to whom, what was said openly, and what was whispered only in kitchens and corridors. She learned that overseers competed among themselves, that house slaves heard conversations never meant for them, that ledgers, not whips, governed the true power of the plantation. She noticed how William Caldwell left legal papers scattered when home from Natchez, how his parents assumed no one in the room could read. She noticed which men were careless, which were ambitious, and which feared exposure more than loss. And she understood something fundamental. The plantation was not held together by strength alone. It was held together by information, and information, carefully gathered and precisely placed, could bend outcomes without ever revealing the hand that moved it. By the time spring gave way to early summer, Marie Laveau had done nothing remarkable. She had obeyed, she had worked, she had healed fevers and dressed wounds, yet already, quietly, the balance around her had begun to shift. No one noticed it yet, but they would, and when they did, the consequences would reach far beyond the fields of Mississippi. By early June, the rhythm of Caldwell Plantation had settled back into its familiar cadence. Cotton rows stretched green and orderly under the Mississippi sun. Overseers walked their routes with practiced authority, and the quarters hummed with the low, constant labor of survival. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath that surface, small currents had begun to shift, almost imperceptibly, like pressure building beneath still water. Marie understood patience. She did not act quickly because quick actions attracted attention. Instead, she watched. She listened. She learned which conversations mattered and which were noise. She learned who noticed patterns and who ignored them. She learned who feared consequences and who believed themselves untouchable. The first weeks passed without incident, and that was intentional. A new slave who caused immediate disruption would be watched closely. One who blended into routine became invisible. Marie cultivated that invisibility carefully. She became indispensable without becoming prominent. The herb garden flourished under her care. Fevers that once lingered now broke within days. Infections that would have crippled field hands healed cleanly. People began seeking her out, not just because her remedies worked, but because she listened without judgment. Pain loosened tongues, and Marie never interrupted. She asked questions gently, as if out of concern rather than curiosity. Names, dates, places, always small details, always stored away. She learned that Elijah Crow kept his ledgers locked in the plantation office, but left them unattended during meals. She learned that two assistant overseers, Matthew Pierce and Robert Lang, despised each other quietly, each hoping to replace the other when the opportunity arose. She learned that Margaret Caldwell worried endlessly about finances, though she never spoke of it directly. That Jonathan Caldwell trusted numbers more than people. That William Caldwell underestimated everyone who worked in his parents' house. And she learned how fear moved. Fear moved downward quickly, but upward only when shaped carefully. The first test came sooner than Marie expected. In late June, a field hand named Isaac was accused of damaging a cotton gin part through negligence. Isaac was strong, steady, and known for his discipline. He had a wife and a newborn son. The accusation came from Robert Lang, one of Crow's assistants, who was eager to establish authority. The broken part was discovered during inspection, and Lang claimed Isaac had been responsible for maintenance that week. The punishment would be severe. Damage to equipment meant loss of profit. Loss of profit demanded an example. Isaac swore he hadn't touched the part, that it had been worn for months, that anyone could see the metal fatigue. But his word meant nothing against an overseer's claim. He was locked in the small shed near the gin house to await punishment at the end of the week, when discipline was usually carried out publicly. Marie heard of it not through gossip, but through desperation. Isaac's wife, Naomi, came to her late one evening, her voice shaking, her child clutched to her chest. She did not ask for miracles. She asked if Marie could listen. Marie did more than listen. She asked Naomi questions others never thought to ask. Who last repaired the gin? Who signed off on its condition? Who benefited if Isaac were removed from his position? Naomi didn't know all the answers, but she knew one thing that mattered. A traveling mechanic had serviced the gin weeks earlier, a white man hired through a Natchez broker, and the repair had been rushed. Marie filed the information away. The next morning, she did not rush to act. She went about her work. She delivered remedies to the quarters near the gin house, making casual conversation. She learned that Matthew Pierce, the other assistant overseer, had argued with Lang 2 days earlier about maintenance reports, that Lang had dismissed the concern.
Marie visited the laundry where Sarah worked and asked, gently, if she had noticed anything unusual. Sarah mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Margaret Caldwell had complained about unexpected expenses in the gin repairs, that invoices didn't match what she remembered approving. That was the opening. Marie did not confront anyone. She did not accuse. She planted confusion. While treating Margaret Caldwell for persistent headaches, Marie mentioned, with careful uncertainty, that she'd overheard 2 men arguing near the gin house about maintenance reports. She said she wasn't sure she understood, but thought one of them mentioned an invoice error. She apologized for mentioning it at all, framing it as idle chatter that troubled her conscience. Margaret did not dismiss it. Later that evening, she mentioned it to her husband. Jonathan Caldwell frowned. Numbers that didn't align irritated him deeply. He ordered the gin records reviewed. The records revealed inconsistencies. Maintenance reported as complete before it was. Repairs charged twice. Lang's handwriting appeared on documents he shouldn't have handled. The traveling mechanic's invoice showed work done hurriedly, improperly. Suddenly, Isaac's guilt was no longer certain. Caldwell ordered the mechanic summoned for questioning. The man admitted the repair had been rushed under Lang's instruction, that Lang wanted the gin operational quickly to increase output numbers before inspection. The punishment never happened. Isaac was released quietly, returned to work without explanation. Lang received a formal warning. His authority weakened. Pierce watched carefully, saying nothing. No one ever credited Marie, but the quarters understood. Not in words, in looks, in a shift of posture, in the way people began bringing their troubles to her, not loudly, but with expectation. They did not say she could fix things, they said she might know something. Marie made sure not to intervene again immediately. Too many resolved conflicts drew attention. She returned to herbs, to routine, to silence. But the system had been tested, and it had bent. Over the next months, she intervened only when the outcome mattered deeply. A woman threatened with separation from her child. A man falsely accused of theft when tools went missing due to overseer negligence. Each time the pattern was the same. Information gathered, leverage identified, doubt introduced, authority forced to correct itself. By autumn, something subtle had changed. The overseers felt it first. Crow began noticing that accusations no longer held the same weight, that plantation owners asked more questions, that mistakes were examined instead of accepted. He could not identify the source. He suspected incompetence, coincidence, bad luck. But suspicion has a way of searching for form. He began watching Marie. She noticed immediately. Not because he followed her closely, but because his questions shifted. He asked where she'd been, whom she'd spoken to, why people trusted her. She answered calmly, always grounding herself in her role. Herbs, healing, listening. Listening, she said, was not a crime. By winter, Crow's frustration grew. He saw outcomes changing without visible resistance. The plantation population seemed quieter, but not subdued. Problems dissolved before punishment could be administered. Authority was being undermined without challenge. That frightened him. Men like Crow feared rebellion because it was visible. This was something else, something quieter, something he could not lash. And when fear lacks a clear target, it often turns towards superstition. Whispers began to circulate among overseers, that Marie knew things she shouldn't, that people spoke to her before trouble disappeared, that her remedies worked too well. Marie heard the whispers before they reached Crow. She adjusted again. She began making small mistakes publicly, forgetting names, asking naive questions, presenting herself as helpful but unsophisticated. She spoke more of her grandmother's stories, of old beliefs, of luck and signs. She leaned into what they expected an herb woman to be. It bought her time, but it did not erase suspicion, because power once challenged remembers, and Crow was beginning to understand that whatever Marie Laveau was doing, it did not look like rebellion, which made it far more dangerous. The next confrontation would not involve broken equipment or false accusations. It would involve something far worse. And when that moment came, Marie would have to decide whether silence was still enough.
The turning point came not with accusation, but with debt. By the spring of 1840, Caldwell Plantation was no longer as secure as it appeared from the road. Cotton prices had begun to fluctuate unpredictably, and Jonathan Caldwell had made several speculative decisions that failed to produce the returns he expected. On paper, the plantation was still prosperous. In reality, obligations were tightening. Notes came due. Creditors grew less patient. And in the private spaces of the big house, concern began to replace confidence. Marie learned this the same way she learned everything else, not through a single conversation, but through fragments. Margaret Caldwell's headaches worsened. William spoke more often of temporary arrangements and short-term solutions. A visiting merchant lingered longer than expected and left dissatisfied. A ledger left open on a desk told its own quiet story. Debt did not announce itself loudly. It whispered. And debt had consequences for people at the bottom long before it troubled those at the top. The first sign came when a woman named Clara was called into the overseer's office. Clara was a seamstress, skilled and precise, responsible for mending and making clothing for both the enslaved and, occasionally, the Caldwell family. She had a daughter, 8 years old, who worked as a helper in the kitchen. When Clara returned from the office, her face held a stillness that frightened those who knew her best. She was to be sold, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was valuable. The buyer was a planter in Louisiana, known for working slaves hard and replacing them quickly. The sale would cover part of Caldwell's outstanding debt. Clara's daughter would remain behind. The news moved through the quarters like a wound opening. People did not cry out. They did not protest. They understood too well how such things worked, but that understanding did not soften the blow. It sharpened it. Marie came to Clara that night. She did not beg. She simply stated what was happening and asked one question. Is there anything that can be done? Marie did not answer immediately. This was different. This was not a mistake to correct or a lie to unravel. This was a deliberate decision driven by money, and money was harder to move than pride or fear. Marie asked Clara to tell her everything she knew, who the buyer was, when the sale was scheduled, what debts the Caldwells owed. Clara knew little beyond what she had overheard while working near the library and dining room, but little, when placed correctly, could become leverage. Marie began gathering information with renewed urgency. She learned that the buyer, a man named Samuel Grayson, had business disputes throughout Louisiana, that his reputation was poor, even among other planters, that William Caldwell was representing a client in a legal dispute directly involving Grayson. That mattered a great deal. William Caldwell's career depended on perception. He was positioning himself as a respectable, rising figure in Mississippi legal circles. Selling slaves to a man he was actively opposing in court was not illegal, but it was unseemly. It risked conflict of interest. It invited scrutiny. Marie needed that scrutiny. She did not speak to William. She did not speak to Jonathan. She let the information travel. Sarah mentioned the impending sale to the house steward while folding linens. The steward mentioned it to William in passing, concerned that the household seemed unsettled. William's reaction was immediate. He questioned his father that evening. Jonathan Caldwell dismissed the concern at first. Debt demanded solutions. Appearances were secondary. But Marie was working on the second pressure point. She learned that another planter in Adams County, Thomas Whitaker, had recently come into liquid capital.
Through land sales, Whitaker despised Grayson. The rivalry was old, bitter, and public. If Whitaker knew Caldwell was selling slaves to Grayson, he might intervene, not out of mercy, but advantage. Marie could not speak to Whitaker, but others could. Information moved outward through merchants, drivers, kitchen hands, and slaves hired out temporarily to nearby estates. The story changed subtly with each telling. It became less about Clara and more about Caldwell's vulnerability, about debt, about opportunity. Whitaker heard, and Whitaker acted. Within a week, Whitaker approached Jonathan Caldwell with an alternative: a loan, favorable terms, a share in future harvests. In return, Caldwell would avoid dealing with Grayson and commit future cotton sales through Whitaker's broker. It was not generosity. It was business. But it was enough. The sale was canceled. Clara stayed. Her daughter stayed. No announcement was made. No explanation given. The decision simply vanished as if it had never existed. In the quarters, people understood. Marie had not defied authority, she had redirected it. But such redirection left marks. Elijah Crow noticed the pattern clearly now. 2 overseer reprimands, a punishment reversed, a sale canceled, always preceded by quiet conversations, always followed by the same name surfacing at the edges: Marie.
He began watching her more closely. He searched her cabin. He questioned others about her. He found nothing overt, and nothing terrified him more, because the absence of evidence suggested something he could not punish. He began speaking of witchcraft. The word spread carefully at first, among overseers, among drivers. It was a word that explained what logic could not, a word that justified fear, a word that invited violence without proof. Marie heard the word before it was spoken to her. She knew what came next. Witchcraft accusations did not require evidence, they required belief, and belief, once ignited, was difficult to extinguish. She prepared. She reduced her interventions. She stopped acting on cases that involved finances or family separations. She returned to herbs and silence. But silence did not erase what had already been seen. By late summer, Crow brought his suspicions to Jonathan Caldwell. He did not accuse Marie of rebellion. That would require proof. Instead, he accused her of influence, of knowing too much, of stirring unrest. Caldwell listened carefully. He did not dismiss Crow outright, but he did not act immediately either. He ordered Marie brought to the house. The summons came on a humid morning, heavy with the scent of rain and consequence. Marie walked toward the big house calmly, her posture steady, her eyes lowered. She knew this moment had always been coming, and she knew that survival would depend not on denying intelligence, but on redefining it. What happened inside that house would determine whether her work ended in punishment or evolved into something even more dangerous. And when Marie crossed that threshold, she carried nothing with her, except understanding. The library of the Caldwell house was designed to project certainty. Shelves of leather-bound volumes lined the walls, their spines signaling education, law, and inherited authority. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching dust in the air like suspended time. It was a room meant to remind anyone who entered that knowledge belonged to a certain class and power followed naturally from it. Marie stood at the center of the room with her hands folded, her gaze lowered, her breathing even. Jonathan Caldwell sat behind his desk. Elijah Crow stood to one side, rigid with restrained satisfaction. Margaret Caldwell watched from a chair near the window, her expression unreadable. The accusation was delivered carefully. Crow spoke of patterns, of disturbances that never quite broke rules but weakened discipline all the same, of slaves who seemed bolder, calmer, less afraid, of a woman who listened too much, knew too much, and around whom outcomes shifted in ways he could not account for. He did not say witchcraft at first. He let the implication form on its own. Caldwell listened without interruption. Then he turned to Marie. He asked simple questions, where she had learned about herbs, how long she had practiced, whether people came to her for advice beyond medicine. Marie answered truthfully, but selectively. She spoke of her grandmother, of learning plants as a child, of listening to people because pain often carried worry with it. She said she gave comfort, not counsel, that sometimes listening helped people endure what they could not change. Crow pressed harder. He said she influenced outcomes, that punishments failed, that authority weakened. Marie did not deny that things changed. She reframed why. She said illness improved when treated properly, that misunderstandings resolved when people spoke instead of assuming, that fear caused more trouble than truth, that sometimes simply asking questions made people realize mistakes had been made. She did not say she acted, she said others did. Caldwell asked about literacy. Marie admitted she could read some, enough to follow instructions, enough to keep records of remedies. She did not claim fluency. She did not boast. She presented literacy as a tool, not a threat. Crow objected. Literacy was dangerous. Slaves were not meant to read. Caldwell disagreed. He said intelligence was not illegal, that usefulness justified tolerance, that Marie's work reduced illness and loss,
that no evidence of rebellion existed. Then Caldwell produced her journal. It had been taken from her cabin without her knowledge. Marie felt the weight of that moment settle in her chest, but she did not show it. The journal was opened. Pages turned slowly. Caldwell read notes about soil, seasons, plant pairings, remedies written in careful script. To an untrained eye, it was exactly what Marie claimed it to be. Crow saw nothing because he did not know how to look. Caldwell saw enough to hesitate. He closed the journal. He said there was no proof of wrongdoing, that suspicion alone could not justify punishment, that Marie would return to her duties but under observation. It was not trust, it was containment. Marie left the house with her journal remaining behind. She did not ask for it. She understood the boundary had been drawn clearly. She had survived, but survival came at a cost. From that day forward, she was watched. Her movements were noted, her conversations scrutinized. The margin for error disappeared. So she changed again. She became smaller. She acted less. She intervened only when others could finish what she began. She taught quietly, not methods, but ways of seeing, how to notice who held power, how to listen without appearing to gather information, how to let others speak first. She understood something crucial now. Her value was no longer in what she did, it was in what she had already set in motion. By 1841, the network she had built extended beyond Caldwell Plantation. Enslaved people moved between estates, hired laborers traveled. Information crossed boundaries that chains could not. Marie became a node rather than a center. And then something unexpected happened. Caldwell's finances worsened. The cotton market collapsed harder than anticipated. Creditors grew aggressive. Sales were discussed openly. Families whispered about separation again. Marie did not intervene immediately. She waited. She gathered. She learned which debts were most dangerous, which creditors feared exposure, which rivals would seize opportunity. She understood that the same system that enslaved her also constrained her owners, and constraints created leverage. By 1843, she had quietly helped several people achieve something unthinkable: legal freedom. Not escape, not flight, freedom purchased, negotiated, arranged through the law that claimed to deny it. A carpenter allowed to buy his release, a woman manumitted in exchange for service agreements, each case hidden within acceptable transactions, each invisible to anyone not looking for patterns. Marie herself could have followed. She had saved enough. She had connections. Louisiana laws offered possibilities Mississippi denied. But leaving meant abandoning the network, and Marie did not believe freedom was only personal. Then, in 1845, the system struck back. A messenger carrying coded information was stopped on the road, a letter found, interpreted, misunderstood, but suspicious enough. This time, Crow had something tangible. Marie was arrested, placed in the plantation jail. The quarters fell silent. But silence did not mean collapse, because Marie had planned for this too. From her cell, she sent one final message, not to the enslaved, to William Caldwell. And what she offered him would force a choice that changed everything. The consequences of that choice would send Marie Laveau out of Mississippi forever. But her work would not end there, because some stories do not conclude with freedom. They transform into something harder to erase. And what waited for Marie beyond the river would ensure that history could never fully bury her again. The plantation jail was never meant to hold people for long. It was a narrow brick structure near the edge of the overseer's yard, built for containment rather than habitation. No windows, a single iron door, enough space to stand, barely enough to sit. The point was not imprisonment, it was anticipation, the waiting, the knowledge that something worse was coming.
Marie sat on the packed dirt floor with her back against the wall, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She did not pace, she did not cry. Panic would have served no purpose now. Everything that could be done had already been prepared. Elijah Crow believed he had finally won. The letter found on the messenger was not explicit, but it did not need to be. It spoke of movements, of transfers, of values and timing disguised beneath agricultural language. To Crow, it proved what he had always suspected: coordination, organization, intent. He brought it to Jonathan Caldwell as evidence that Marie was not merely clever, but dangerous. This time, Caldwell could not dismiss it. The letter proved that information was moving under Marie's direction, that enslaved people were communicating across plantations, that knowledge of finances, sales, and legal matters was circulating where it should not. Caldwell did not believe in witchcraft, but he did believe in order. Marie's existence had become inconvenient. Punishment was discussed, severe punishment. There were examples to be made, messages to send. But Caldwell hesitated, not out of mercy, but calculation. Marie was valuable, intelligent, skilled. Executing her would waste an asset. Selling her south to harsher conditions risked attention if she died quickly, and Crow's obsession with her had begun to feel personal. William Caldwell arrived from Natchez 3 days later. He was older now, more confident. His law practice had grown. His political ambitions were no longer speculative. Reputation mattered more than ever. He requested to see the evidence. And then he received the message Marie had sent. It reached him through channels he did not know existed. A folded note, brief, precise. It referenced a property dispute William had struggled with for months. Documents missing. A case stalled. His credibility at risk. Marie told him where the documents were, and she told him how to retrieve them legally. In return, she asked for one thing: not freedom, removal. Sell her to Louisiana, to a buyer who would not break her, someone with connections to free people of color, someone who needed her skills. William understood immediately. This was not a plea, it was an exchange. He verified the information. The documents were exactly where Marie said they would be. His case turned overnight, his reputation strengthened, his future secured. Then he went to his father. He argued calmly. Marie was too dangerous to keep, too valuable to destroy. Selling her to a known contact in New Orleans would profit the plantation and eliminate the problem without scandal. Louisiana laws would absorb her. Mississippi would forget her. Jonathan Caldwell agreed. In June of 1845, Marie Laveau was sold for $1,000 to a free black woman in New Orleans who ran a boarding house and herbal practice. Officially, it was a routine transaction. Unofficially, it was exile. Marie left Mississippi under guard, crossing the river that had carried so much wealth built on silence. She did not look back. Behind her, the network she built continued, quieter now, more cautious, not as effective, but alive. In New Orleans, Marie entered a different world, one where free black communities existed in fragile equilibrium, where laws were inconsistent, where danger still lingered, but possibility existed. She worked, she observed, she waited. Records from that period grow thin, deliberately so. Some say she purchased her freedom within a year. Others claim she never needed to. Some claim she disappeared into the city's layered anonymity. Others say she became something else entirely. But what is certain is this: the Marie Laveau remembered in legend bears only a shadow of resemblance to the woman Mississippi tried to erase. Because the real threat was never her mystique, it was her method. She proved that slavery did not fail only because of rebellion or war, but because it relied on the belief that intelligence could be owned. And intelligence, once awake, cannot be chained. That is why her story was never taught, and why, even now, it still unsettles those who hear it. The city received her without ceremony. New Orleans in the summer of 1845 was thick with heat, sound, and contradiction. Music drifted through narrow streets. Commerce moved openly alongside cruelty. Free black communities existed in uneasy proximity to bondage, tolerated when useful, crushed when inconvenient. It was a city where information traveled faster than law, and survival depended on knowing which truths could be spoken aloud and which had to be disguised. Marie understood immediately that Louisiana was not freedom, it was opportunity. She arrived at the boarding house owned by Helen Dupree, a free woman of color whose business quietly catered to sailors, merchants, and tradesmen who preferred discretion. Helen needed someone skilled, quiet, and reliable. Marie fit perfectly. She cooked, she tended herbs, she listened, and once again, without announcing herself, she began to observe. New Orleans offered something Mississippi never had: layers. Layers of race, class, legality, and identity that overlapped rather than aligned cleanly. A man enslaved in one parish might be free in another. Papers mattered, signatures mattered, and mistakes in records could change lives. Marie learned the city the same way she learned plantations. Slowly. She learned which clerks accepted bribes and which feared exposure, which judges ruled predictably, which lawyers quietly assisted free people of color navigating the law's narrow gaps. She learned how freedom was purchased not just with money, but with timing and silence. Within a year, she was legally free, not through miracle, through transaction. Her freedom papers listed her as a skilled domestic and herbalist, purchased and manumitted by Helen Dupree. The cost was high, but the return was worth more than money. Marie was no longer property. She could move, trade, learn, and most importantly, connect. But freedom did not end her work. It expanded it. Marie did not announce herself as anything remarkable. She did not seek influence openly. She built relationships with dock workers, with laundresses, with clerks, with enslaved people hired out temporarily. She understood that New Orleans was not a single system, but many overlapping ones, each with its own vulnerabilities. She became known quietly as someone who helped, not with escape, with navigation. She showed people how to save, how to negotiate, how to find lawyers who would listen, how to read documents that decided their fate. She taught others what she had learned in Mississippi, not strategies, but perspective, how to see systems not as walls, but as mechanisms. Her name began to circulate, not loudly, carefully. By the 1850s, Marie Laveau had become something the South found deeply unsettling: a free black woman with influence, not mystical influence, structural influence. White society, unable to explain her reach, began to reinterpret it. Rumors replaced understanding, rituals replaced records. Superstition became safer than admitting intelligence. They called her a witch, they called her a priestess, they called her dangerous. It was easier than admitting the truth, because the truth was this: Marie Laveau did not dismantle slavery with spells or sermons. She exposed its weakest point, its dependence on ignorance. And that is why her real story was buried beneath myth, because legends are harmless, but methods can be repeated. And that is the lesson America refused to teach. What followed was not recorded in ledgers or court documents. It unfolded in patterns. Marie understood something most people never did: that once a method exists, it does not need its creator to survive. By the time she was free, her influence had already outgrown her physical presence. People she had trained in Mississippi continued quietly. Others she mentored in New Orleans carried the approach forward without ever using her name. They did not speak of plans, they spoke of observations. They did not issue instructions, they asked questions. Systems began to fail in small ways. Sales delayed, papers questioned, contracts reconsidered. Owners blamed clerks, clerks blamed merchants, merchants blamed markets. No one blamed the enslaved because the enslaved were never supposed to understand how any of it worked. That assumption was the system's fatal flaw. Marie never led movements. Movements attracted attention. She influenced trajectories. A man learned how to negotiate his value before being sold. A woman learned how to document promises made by an owner who assumed no one would remember. A family learned which parish laws allowed self-purchase and which did not. Freedom did not arrive dramatically, it arrived administratively. That terrified people far more than rebellion ever had. By the time white society noticed her name spreading, they could no longer trace what she actually did. All they could see were outcomes. Too many favorable outcomes. Too many coincidences clustered around one woman who did not fit any acceptable category. So the story was rewritten. They stripped away her intelligence and replaced it with mystery. They removed her strategy and inserted spectacle. They transformed her into something irrational because irrational things do not inspire imitation. A witch cannot be studied. A method can. That is why textbooks avoided her. That is why records blurred. That is why myth swallowed truth. Because if Marie Laveau was simply a legend, then nothing she represented had to be confronted. But if she was a strategist, a systems thinker, a woman who understood power better than those who claimed to own it, then slavery was not only cruel, it was fragile.
And fragility is dangerous to admit. Marie lived the rest of her life without seeking recognition. She did not correct the rumors. She did not clarify the myths. She allowed the mask to exist, because masks protect the face beneath them. And in doing so, she ensured something far more important than her own reputation. She ensured continuity. Long after her name faded into folklore, her approach remained alive, quietly shaping outcomes wherever people learned to look past force and toward leverage, wherever someone understood that information could travel invisibly, that fear could be redirected, that authority could be forced to correct itself without ever knowing who moved it. That is why her story was never taught, not because it wasn't true, but because it was repeatable. And systems built on control cannot survive the idea that those they control might understand them better than their masters ever did. So, history chose the safer version, the songs, the ceremonies, the legend, and buried beneath all of it, deliberately ignored, was the most unsettling truth of all. That Marie Laveau did not wait for freedom, she engineered it. And once that knowledge exists, no chain is ever quite secure again.